Before that time.
That's the physics behind, for example,
Another question
people the actual change in mass.
under the ultimate question is to evaluate
Over the course of 7 years, the book was put together.
Tonight in the Scholars Chair, a conversation with author and educator Professor Sidney Griffith. He is from the Department of Semitic and Egyptian Languages and Literature at Catholic University. Dr. Sidney Griffith is a scholar of international reputation. His principal area of interest are Arabic Christianity, Syriac monasticism, medieval Christian-Muslim encounters, ecumenical and interfaith dialogue. For the next 30 minutes, we will discuss Dr. Griffith's book called The Church in the Shadow of the Mosque, Christian and Muslims in the World of Islam, From the Ancient to the Modern World. At Focus, how would a Christian scholar describe Muslim-Christian relationships today as opposed to the 17th century? Our interview in 1 minute, here in the Scholars Chair.
Let the conditions of inequality that we suffered under, when we are the oppressor, the dominant class, let's not impose that injustice on the others.
Anybody think that you could have a just system without giving women their rights?
Everyone has an opinion, and we sit around the marketplace and talk about opinion, but what is truth?
With the shareholder, their goal is similar to the business, to maximize profit.
That belief becomes a context for a development of knowledge.
Say physics is the DNA of technology because the rules for how you build new technology starts in physics.
Because Quran challenges the people. It's not only the people of the book, it challenges Muslims.
We say secular, they hear godless.
Right.
What was intended?
Watch the Scholars Chair every Monday night. And here is your host. Welcome to the Scholars Chair, Professor Griffith, and we are very excited that you could make it with us. You have written a book called The Church in the Shadow of the Mosque, Christian and Muslims in the World of Islam. I want to ask you, what do you think about the modern Christian-Muslim relationships as it relates to how Muslim and Christians got along in the 17th century?
Well, I think relationships between Christian communities and Muslim communities are different in different parts of the world. But for the most part, relationships between our communities in the present day are different from earlier times because of the different historical circumstances and the different political developments that have taken place in our world, particularly in the 20th century, and now, of course, reaching into our new 21st century, still very new. And for the most part, in the earlier period, Christians lived in countries where Muslims ruled, or Muslims lived in countries where Christians ruled, and they, for the most part, lived according to the rules and regulations of those countries, which had ways of protecting the interests of their communities, including the minority communities. But in the 20th and the 21st centuries, we live in a different world where secular governments, for the most part, hold the power, and people are generally of the opinion somehow that secular governments are more protective of the interests of more people than when it was the case that our religious community lived under the rule of one or another religiously inspired government. So it's a different set of attitudes, but there are many things that are similar, and that's why I think it's important for us to look back to the history of the relationships between our communities in earlier times to see what lessons we could learn from those experiences of earlier times, and how might they help us live together as God-fearing peoples in different communities in the present day. So,
interesting.
Yeah.
The question, when a person reads your book,
Yes.
and the title is the Church in the Shadow of the Mosque, Christian and Muslims in the World of Islam. I want to kind of find out what historical framework are you working with, and what do you think, and what is the purpose of the book?
Well, the purpose of the book is basically to call people's attention to the history, especially of Christian communities who not only lived among Muslims, but lived under Muslim rule for many centuries. Most Christians in the Western world, and by the Western world, I guess I basically mean the non-Muslim world, or the United States and Europe, are often unaware of the fact that large Christian communities lived among Muslims for many, many centuries. And
these would be Arab-speaking Christians.
Arabic-speaking Christians for the most part, but not entirely Arabic-speaking Christians, because there were parts of the Muslim world where Arabic, of course, was the language of the Quran and the sacred language, so to speak, but people spoke another local language like Turkish, for example, or Persian. But still, they were Islamic countries in part of the Islamic world, and there were large communities of Christians living in these countries along with Muslims and under Muslim rule for many centuries. So it seems to me that in the West, where now we live together, Christians and Muslims and Jews and people of other religious communities, which was not normally a common social situation in centuries gone by. Perhaps we have something to learn from the relationship between the Christians and Muslims in the Islamic world, as well as the history of Muslim-Christian relationships in the West. But that's been mostly, for many centuries, a kind of hostile relationship because our countries had been in war with one another, and of course we know what happens when countries are at war with one another. The populations begin to demonize the other, and so we have a large heritage of that sort of demonization of the other, both among Christians and Muslims. So
let me ask Professor Griffith, why is it that we know so little about these Arabic-speaking Christians?
The Christians who lived in the Arabic-speaking world. Well, there are many answers to that, I suppose, but one reason may be that, for the most part, the Christians who lived in the Arabic-speaking world were in Christian communities who were not in the direct historical line that led to Western Christianity. So most Christians in the Western world today are either Roman Catholics or Orthodox Christians or Protestant Christians, but these communities are all communities of Western Christian people who for a number of centuries had been separated from Christians in the East, mainly those living in Islamic-ruled countries. And I think the alienation between these communities started in a much earlier time, having to do with theological differences that caused the communities to separate from one another. And so most of the Christian communities whose people lived in the Islamic world belonged to churches who were not in the direct historical line of the Western Christian communities, some of whom looked upon them as being heretical or...
Why would they do that? I mean, what would be the deal breaker between the two?
Well, they go back to earlier theological controversies, in part, going way back even to the 4th and the 5th and the 6th centuries of the Christian era, when the big theological question among Christians had to do with what's the best way, not just the best way, but what's the truest way to express what it is that Christians actually believe about the identity of Jesus of Nazareth. Who is Jesus of Nazareth? And each community developed formulae that gave expression to their faith, and usually they had philosophical terms in play that required definition and things like this. So gradually they were engaged in controversy about these matters, and decisions were made, and some people went along with the decisions and other people didn't, and so the communities began to draw apart from one another. But probably there were, as in our day, there were other factors involved. Probably political factors, sociological factors, cultural factors. It's very difficult to assign the cause to any one of them.
How did the Arabic Christians, the Arabic-speaking Christians, define themselves? How did they name themselves? What were they called?
Well, for the most part, at least originally, it seems that most of the Arabic-speaking Christians, say in the time of Muhammad or just before the rise of Islam, were Christian communities in the Arabic-speaking world whose Christianity is very defined by the Aramaic-speaking Christians with whom the Arabic speakers were in close contact and from whom it seems they first learned their Christianity. And so these would be communities of Christians who belonged for the most part to the Syrian Orthodox Church, as it's called in modern times, or to the Assyrian Church of the East, to name another large Christian community at that time, whom people called Nestorian, or the Syrian Orthodox. At the time, people called them Jacobite. Usually these were names given to them by their adversaries. And these are two churches who were, after, say, the middle of the 6th century, no longer really in communion with churches in the West, the Greek-speaking and Latin-speaking Christians in particular, for theological reasons. And it goes back even earlier to the middle of the 5th century, 451, and the Council of Chalcedon. So there were two different communities. But the Arabic-speaking Christians seem to have been growing in number precisely around the time of the Prophet Muhammad. But the people outside of his immediate milieu, say in Mecca and Medina, in the Hijaz and Arabia, were not speaking Arabic. But after the Arabic conquest, the Islamic conquest, as we sometimes call it, which was pretty much complete by the year 650, at least as far as the shores of the Mediterranean. Well, once all these areas came under Islamic rule, of course, gradually Arabic became the official language of the government and
and scholars as well.
And of scholarship, that's right. And so by 150 years or so after the death of the Prophet Muhammad in the year 632, Jews were speaking and writing in Arabic, Christians were speaking and writing in Arabic, who previously spoke and wrote in Aramaic or Greek.
What a wonderful community to study. It's a fascinating study. What was the reaction of these Arabic-speaking Christians to the message of the Quran from the Prophet? What was their
Well,
response?
initially, as we learn of it from early texts, for the most part written in Syriac or Greek, we find different views. So one of the earliest of them speaks of a prophet who has arisen among the Arabs. And in one very early text, there was an argument between the people whose story is told in the text about, well, is this a true prophet or not? And one espoused the view that, well, if he comes with a sword, he is not a true prophet. This was the view of one person. But you find other views. Some people, it's in both Syriac and Greek texts that have survived, speak of how important it is that this prophet brought monotheism to the Arabic-speaking people, for example.
I see.
There's another text that was written by a Syriac-speaking author who actually lived in Baghdad and had a conversation with the Caliph al-Mahdi, who asked him straight out what did he think about the Prophet Muhammad. And this person, who was a member of the Assyrian Church of the East, was a patriarch, Timothy I. He said that he thought that Muhammad walked on the way of the prophets. Now, he was very careful in his choice of words, but after all, he was a Christian, not a Muslim.
Yes.
But his view is a very positive one.
Yes, a very positive view.
So we can find negative ones.
Yes,
of course.
I am absolutely sure, because we have them today.
Yes.
It's my understanding that the prophet did not insist on Jews and Christians to convert to Islam. Do you concur with that position, and if so, why?
Yes, I think that it's clear in the Quran, and certainly in later legal systems of the Islamic world, that Jews and Christians were considered Ahl Kitab, people of the scriptures. I like to translate the phrase as being believers in God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, which the Quran mentions several times. Yes. And so the Quran, I think, and early Muslims wanted to call the Jews and the Christians to Islam, but were willing to respect them in their own faith commitments with the conditions that are mentioned in the Quran, that they maintain a low social profile. That's the way I interpret the particular verse. And they pay the jizya, or the tax, which guarantees them the protection of the Islamic government.
Yes.
That's a fairly positive development, albeit that the people who are in this dhimmi status as may not feel that they are full citizens of the realm. That's, I think, true, but it's also true that the law preserves their rights or respects their rights.
Respects their religion.
Yes.
I quite agree. How does the Quran address the Jews and Christians? I have one verse that you included in your book, and I must tell you that I found the book very stimulating. I found it textually accurate. You went to the primary sources, and I greatly appreciate that. That's not done very often. But the Quranic verse says, and I'll read it for you, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. It says, and before this was a book of Moses as a guide and a mercy, and this book confirms it in the Arabic tongue to admonish the unjust, and a glad tiding to those who do right. Now, this is a reference to Moses and the Jews, I would gather. But there is no condemnation, which I found interesting. It says further, it says, behold, you put this in your book, behold, Allah says, O Jesus, I will take thee and raise thee to myself and clean thee of falsehood of those whom blaspheme. I will make those who follow thee superior to those who reject faith. To the day of resurrection, then ye all return unto me, and I will judge between you and the matters in which ye dispute. I found the delicacy of those texts, of this text interesting, that it juxtaposed the message of Christ Jesus against not Jews or Muslims, but against the non-believers, the rejectors of faith, which is in the Quranic view are not Jews and Christians or Muslims for that matter. What is your view?
Well, I think that passage, along with many others that one could cite, gives us an insight, if you will, into the particular message that the Quran brings. And if you look at what the Quran has to say about the messengers who came before the Prophet Muhammad, one gradually realizes that the text is telling us that in God's providence, all these messengers and prophets brought the same message, but that in most instances, their followers eventually fell into an error of one sort or another, and another prophet or messenger would come along to correct that error. And I think we can see this in the instance of the mention of Moses in this passage, for example, because the Quran obviously has very positive things to say about Moses and about the Torah, which is the scripture, the kitab, that in the Quran's view, God gave Moses to bring to his people. But over the course of history, some among the people, at least in the Quran's view, fell away from appropriate observance into perhaps wrong opinions or sinful ways of life. In due course, God sent Jesus, whom the Quran calls the Messiah, the son of Mary, to bring the message to the sons of Israel, the Bnei Israel, from whom he came. But then, from the Quran's point of view, his followers, whom the Quran calls An-Nasara, the Quran never uses the word Christian, so the question always comes up, well, why does the Quran call the followers of Jesus Nasara? And like every other issue, that gets a little complicated, but my view is because it means Nazarenes, and there's a passage in the Acts of the Apostles that speak of Paul as the leader of the group of the Nazarenes, or the sect of the Nazarenes, and the Nazarenes are those who follow the Nazarene, who is Jesus the Messiah. So I think that's where the connection is, and that the Quran is well aware of that. It wasn't a normal usage that Christians would use that for themselves, but it was a known designation for them, usually used, it seems, by non-Christians, but the Quran knows that, and I think that's why 14 times in the Quran this word is used, and the word Christian itself is never used. So why would that be? Because it seems to me it fits with the Quran's view of the sequence of God's prophets and messengers, and keeps the focus on this important point from the Quran's perspective. So.
Oh, I see. I never thought about that.
Yeah.
Instead of putting the prophet's name in front of the religion,
Yeah.
you place the location of where the people are from.
Yeah.
Which is interesting.
Well, people, it seems, called Jesus the Nazarene.
Yes,
I mean, we find that many times in the Gospel.
Yes.
It's just that only once in the Acts of the Apostles do we find a Roman official actually referring to the associates of Paul as, or referring to Paul himself as a leader of the sect of the Nazarenes.
I love it.
So,
I love the connection.
Yeah.
You have written in your book some very interesting Quranic verses. I want to kind of be brief and summarize it for our audience. And you refer to the people of the book, or at least you refer to the Quran, and it says here, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim, O people of the book, commit no excesses in your religion, nor say to Allah naught but the truth. Jesus Christ, the Son of Mary, was no more than the apostle of God, Allah, it says here. And his word, which he bestowed on Mary, and a spirit proceeding from him. So believe in God, believe in Allah and his apostle. Say not Trinity, desist. It will be better for you, for our God, Allah, is one God. Glory be to him, exalted is he above having a son. To him belong all things in the heavens and earth, and enough is Allah as the disposal of affairs. Again, not condemning Christ, nor Mary, nor the message that Christ brought, but it's insisting on this relationship that God is the disposal of all human affairs. Interesting, very challenging verse, isn't it?
Yeah. It's a very important verse. I mean, and it comes in Surah An-Nisa, the fourth surah, and it comes toward the end of the surah. And if we look at the structure of this Surah An-Nisa, just prior to the passage that you quoted, the surah is paying attention to the Jewish community of the day and mentioning some matters in connection with the Jewish community, and then comes to the Christian community. It uses the phrase people of the book in both instances, but we know which community it is by reason of what the subject matter is. So I think we have to keep in mind that it's the Quran's intention here, if you will, to critique what it views as excesses on the part of those people of the book who are followers of Jesus. And the passage, it seems to me, wants to correct, to challenge, if you will, what the followers of Jesus of Nazareth are saying with regard to who he is, really, okay? So that's why it begins, do not go to excess in your religion. Do not say about Jesus the Messiah, Mary's son, anything but the truth. So all these words are important.
They are all important.
Each one.
We will have to definitely stop right there, but we have to invite you back because we just got to question number 7 here. And
Yes.
Professor Griffith, thank you very much for coming. We're short on time, but we're going to invite you back.
Very good. Well, these, I think, are important things for us to talk about between our communities. Yes.
I pray so. We've talked more. We've been talking to Dr. Sidney Griffith from Catholic University concerning Muslim-Christian relationships today as opposed to the 17th century. To view more Scholarship Chair programs, go on Read One Communications channel on YouTube or follow us on Facebook. We can also be sent an email to thescholarshipchair@gmail.com. I am Khalil Shadid. Good night.
Hit it, hit it, hit it. amazing.